everybody was united in seeing that the Great Society programs had been making social problems worse. Mm-hmm. Everybody understood that. The question was, what do we do instead?
Christopher DeMuth worked in the Nixon administration, Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government, and the Ronald Reagan administration, one of the few times the stars lined up in that particular order. For more than 20 years, he served as president of the American Enterprise Institute, one of America's preeminent think tanks. Now a fellow at the Hudson Institute, he remains one of Washington's savviest and most public-spirited analysts of modern government in all its derangements. Chris, welcome to the American Mind.
Charles, good to be with you, as always.
I thought we'd talk a little bit about the extraordinary intellectual adventure you had as a young man. You were at Harvard at a time when great unrest was abroad in the land in the late 1960s, but also at a time when there were wonderful people to study with. Ed Banfield, to name one, James Q. Wilson, and then you also found your way into the office of Daniel Patrick Moynihan, although not, I take it, at Harvard. What was it like to be at Harvard then? What was it like to discover these teachers?
It was arresting and disturbing to me at first. I arrived at Harvard a good liberal. My parents had been Adlai Stevenson Democrats. I was unformed. I wasn't that interested in politics. My greatest interest in public affairs was in civil rights. I had been in the South in the early 60s and had become terribly agitated by segregation and its obvious incidents and its victims. So I cared a lot about civil rights. I had been a fan of John F. Kennedy, but aside from that, I was completely unformed. I decided to major in government, mainly I couldn't think of anything else to major in. It seemed rather interesting.
Did you want to change society? Is that why you chose government?
I didn't know. It was an intellectual interest. My background had been in, I'd been a math, science person. I decided I didn't want to spend my life at a bench. Economics seemed too hard. So I majored in government, and I soon found myself in the class of Edward Banfield, a course on urban politics and urban problems, which were the big problems of the day. This was the time of the LBJ Great Society, tremendous ferment following passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, after the focus of race relations issues shifted to the North and to the big cities. And Banfield had a course on the subject where he challenged essentially every contemporary shibboleth and formulation of the nature of the urban crisis. And I can remember thinking that this man is deeply wrong about everything. How did he get to be a Harvard professor? But there was a seriousness to his arguments, and I began to read his work. And eventually I got to go in and see him. I read the entire course, reading list, syllabus, because I was so interested in it, and he started giving me more things.
That's something that most enrolled students don't do.
That's right. But I was just extremely agitated, and I found that on subjects from welfare to race issues to transportation to the organization of City Hall, he seemed to understand and could expostulate the liberal view better than anybody else, and took it apart with such precision and seriousness that it really began to attract my attention. I started thinking this way. At the same time, I started meeting others. James Q. Wilson was a colleague of Banfield's and a sometime co-author with him. Daniel Patrick Moynihan was at the School of Education, and he taught occasional, he did occasional lecturing. Milton Friedman came by and gave lectures in the course. I got to know him as well. And eventually, the great Irving Kristol, who was presiding over the public interest in its first years down in New York City. So I became a young student, a groupie of the group that eventually came to be known as the neoconservatives.
And in this group, what sort of intellectual differences did you notice? Because they didn't agree with each other on everything, and I think Moynihan had his own way of thinking that maybe Banfield would not have cottoned to as much as Jim Wilson did, perhaps?
There were big differences, and I would say that especially with Pat Moynihan, Pat was from the early days greatly in favor of expanding welfare programs. He understood that the structure of welfare undermined family stability, that it was an inducement to family breakup, to illegitimate births. But what he wanted to do was to change the structure to make it more generous, not contingent on there not being a man around the house. And what he eventually succeeded in convincing Richard Nixon to propose, the Family Assistance Program, was very much part of his arsenal of arguments and proposals back several years before that. Banfield was a complete skeptic. He thought that the welfare problems essentially had no solution, and that efforts to expand the welfare state would make problems worse. So and then there were people in the middle, Nat Glazer and Jim Wilson, I think. But these were serious arguments, but they were friendly arguments. Everybody was united in seeing that the Great Society programs had been making social problems worse. Everybody understood that. The question was, what do we do instead? And there were a lot of very smart disagreements on that score.
It was certainly the most exciting time in urban politics, I guess you could say, and the study of urban politics in the 20th century. And you happened to be present at the creation.
Yes, very fortunate. Yes.
Now, Banfield thought that at bottom the problems of poverty and many other urban problems were cultural, as he called them, and that made him almost adamantinely conservative. I mean, skeptical, let's say, of any solutions to these problems. And so, as you talk a little bit about how that played against Moynihan's optimism that there was a ready solution if only you poured more money into the welfare system.
Ed Banfield was ahead of his time. He had views which seemed outrageous back then, which have long since become conventional wisdom. He had written a book that many still regard as his greatest book called The Moral Basis of a Backward Society, where he came to the view that in a poor peasant town in southern Italy, the deep poverty there was mainly the result of what he called amoral familism. People within
not one of the most fleeting
not a felicitous
phrases ever to fall from
right,
his lips, but still.
Right. But a precise one. Within the family, people behaved morally, that is, with a view toward the welfare of others. But they did not conceive, they had no idea of the possibilities of productive, cooperative behavior outside the family. Their view was that society is nature red in tooth and claw, dog eat dog. If you and I are doing something together and you're doing well, it must be at my expense. One can see this in many cultures. And he began to think about the cultural roots of poverty. He had somewhat different views of the nature of poverty in America, and propounded a fairly elaborate thesis based upon what he called time horizon. That is, one's propensity to conduct oneself according to a more or less expansive view of the future, to sacrifice current pleasure for
postponing gratification.
To postpone gratification to later times. And he believed that the problems of poverty were largely the result of these of cultural problems, that they were race neutral, that it could be that blacks, because of their the cultural inheritance of slavery and discrimination, had particular problems that were largely inheritance of the racial past, but that the deepest problems went beyond race. And he often said, if everybody in America became green tomorrow, so there were no whites and blacks, the problems of poverty would essentially persist because they're deeply cultural. Now, that was he was actually attacked as being racist, that he was blaming people for their own problems. That was not his intention. His views would not be regarded as, you could find references to his arguments in speeches of President Obama today. Right. So things have changed, but he was ahead of his time. He believed that proposals such as those of Pat Moynihan were incapable of getting to the roots of the problem. And if he said, but what is your solution? His answer would be to point to an article that he wrote in the Public Interest titled, "Welfare, a Problem Without Solutions." But a lot of people simply found that un-American, not
right.
to have solutions. But he was interested in the intractable constraints upon this set of problems.
And in retrospect, I take it you judge him to have been more correct than Moynihan on this?
I do. And
where did Jim Wilson
in the
fall?
months before the Welfare Reform Act of 1996 passed, Pat gave strenuous arguments against it on the floor of the Senate. There were some people that thought that, well, he'd become a senator and he'd lost touch with his neoconservative roots. That wasn't the case. He was very, very consistent in his views. Pat was a deep and wonderful man and right about many things, but he was not completely right about this. He said that if the Welfare Reform Act passed, people in large numbers would be dying in the gutters of American cities. And we were replacing the LBJ Great Society with a new Great Society where everybody would be sleeping on grates. There are lively debates about the effect of the Welfare Reform Act, but nobody thinks that Pat's predictions have come true.
No. And as a young man in this cauldron in those days, did you, as a sympathizer with the Ripon Society and other sort of liberal Republican causes, did you find Banfield's hopelessness frustrating? I mean, his attitude of hopelessness towards these social problems?
Let me say a word about the Ripon Society, because I did have in these beginnings a very strong libertarian streak, which I retain to this day. The Ripon Society was a group centered at Harvard that conceived of itself as, and was described as, liberal Republicans. And it's true that our champions were Nelson Rockefeller and John Lindsay and people such as that.
Sometimes referred to as liberal Republicans, yes.
Right. We regarded ourselves, what we were, in retrospect, was pro-civil rights libertarians. And if you look at the people that were in the Ripon Society, it included Lee Auspitz, who did the greatest modern exegete of Michael Oakeshott, who did a wonderful essay for your review. George Gilder,
Yes.
Bruce Chapman of the Discovery Institute, Tim Petrie, a longstanding congressman from Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, Peter Wallison of the American Enterprise Institute. So none of these people would be comfortable to be called a liberal or a progressive. Our heroes were people like Milton Friedman, who, unlike Ed, were very reformist. He wanted a negative income tax, and we wanted to abolish the draft, and he wanted to voucherize education. So we were very reform-oriented in a libertarian direction, but civil rights was the defining issue of the day, and Barry Goldwater had voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And that was very, very important to us. So I was a young, bristling, reform-oriented person. I wanted to reform this, that, and the other thing. And Ed would devote himself to explaining how all of my reforms were just as hopeless as the liberal reforms of earlier times, and would his first.
And he did so very patiently. This was
Ed
one
had,
of his traits.
Ed had 3 laws, which are now posted on his website. Banfield's first law was, do no good and no harm will come of it. This was expressed with such intellectual force that it was deeply disturbing, but simply the intellectual challenge of grappling with it and arguing with it, and the fact that he would sit down with an undergraduate for hours and talk through these things and not be surrounded by phalanxes of graduate students and assistants of this and that was a wonderful opportunity, and we became close friends, and he became a second father, even though I found him sometimes exasperating.
But it was a good exasperation.
It was a good exasperation, yes.